So, Colby, what is a constitutional crisis?
I wonder what ChatGPT says is a constitutional crisis. What is a constitutional crisis? Let's see. Occurs when a government faces a severe breakdown in the... That's so stupid. Faces a severe breakdown in the enforcement of its constitution. Okay, well, thanks.
Can't rely on ChatGPT for anything.
Well, it says examples include a president refusing to leave office after losing an election, deadlock between branches of government that halts essential functions, or a court ruling being ignored by other government bodies.
Yeah, that seems good.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and host of our weekly politics roundtables. It's Friday, February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day. I'm joined this week by Justin Juvenile, not juvenile.
Juvenile,
not juvenile, not juvenile, but juvenile.
Yeah.
Who covers the Supreme Court here at the Post.
Yes, my nickname on the playground in third grade was juvenile delinquent. So I'm sensitive about that.
Kids are not creative at all. I don't like that at all. They need to come up with something better.
Yeah.
And I'm also joined by democracy reporter Colby Itkowitz. Hey, Colby.
Hey, happy Valentine's Day.
So today we're going to be talking about how President Donald Trump is testing the powers of the courts, trying to expand his own authority and possibly moving us into some dicey territory for our democracy. So we're going to dig into the court cases against the Trump administration with you, Justin. And with Colby, we're going to explain why some experts are getting worried about a so-called constitutional crisis. Sound good, guys?
Sounds great.
Great.
So, Justin, you have been tracking the lawsuits that have really piled up in the first few weeks of Trump's second term. There's now dozens of court cases attempting to stop Trump's executive actions. We've seen some initial orders in these cases. Can you just give us all a sense of what these cases are generally about and what are the themes that we're seeing within them?
So far, there's been about roughly 75 cases that have been filed against Trump's early executive orders.
In 3.5 weeks.
In 3.5 weeks. So it's just an extraordinary outpouring of legal action. The cases have really targeted almost every executive order that he's filed. We've seen the courts put pauses on his push to end birthright citizenship. We've seen them put pauses on his push to freeze trillions of dollars in federal grants and loans. The courts have also enjoined him from banning transgender troops from the military. They've put a pause on him dismantling USAID, and the list goes on and on. I mean, if you look at the overall picture of the situation, the Trump administration has really amassed a pretty dismal record in the opening weeks where the courts have regularly ruled against him over and over again. And really, he started with this sort of shock and awe type plan to go out and really move quickly and do a lot of things. But there's really been brakes put on that push by the courts. And right now, most of the cases that have come before the courts, he's actually lost.
I think we look at all these cases and we hear about administrations being sued all the time. This is kind of a normal part of the process. But it sounds like you're saying the Trump administration is losing a lot more than we usually see. Is this a reflection of the kinds of things that he's actually trying to do? And what are the themes within that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. If you talk to legal experts who have reviewed all the executive orders that Trump has put out there in the opening weeks of his administration, one common theme across all of them is that the orders themselves regularly violate existing laws. They push the bounds of the Constitution, and also they reinterpret old laws in ways that the laws have not been applied before. So what they say is that a lot of the executive orders are on very shaky legal ground. And a lot of the quick action we've seen in the courts is because, judges are recognizing that a lot of these orders fly in the face of existing law and existing precedent. So they're quickly putting temporary restraining orders on them. And a lot of the legal experts are not that surprised at how things have gone so far.
Yeah, and I think we should say that executive actions by a president, generally speaking, have to act within existing law. A president has some latitude to do things, but the line here is is what the president is doing legal according to laws that Congress has passed and a previous president has signed? And so they can't just do whatever they want. And so that's where the tension really is here. Colby, I wanted to get into, I think, one really telling case that kind of moves us towards what we're talking about today. This week, a federal judge in Rhode Island ruled that the administration was, quote, failing to comply with his order in one such case. That order was to unfreeze federal grant money that the administration had previously frozen. According to the states that sued the Trump administration, some of the money that was supposed to be unfrozen actually wasn't unfrozen. And the judge basically said the Trump administration didn't abide by this court order. Can you just say what this, basically amounts to and why this is a significant development?
Yeah, to your point, the Trump administration was supposed to release his funds. They're claiming that it just takes a while to kind of unwind these things. The order wasn't clear and that they plan to comply.
It's a massive federal bureaucracy
Exactly.
that they need to implement these things with.
Exactly, and that it's complicated. But they're saying that and that they intend to comply with the court orders. But in the same breath, they like to say that these judges are liberal activists, that they're working to undermine the president's legitimate executive authority. Unclear, legitimate. We don't know what the definition of legitimate is there.
It's very subjective.
Right, exactly. What is the president's legitimate executive authority? I think Trump's definition would be very different than maybe some legal experts.
So the reason that this is a major issue is that we've seen some attention-grabbing comments from Trump's allies this week. We've had Elon Musk promoting people on X who are suggesting that the administration should just ignore these court orders. White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt was talking about the idea that, quote, judicial activists were not being honest arbiters of the law. And then the figure that I think is really crucial here, guys, is Vice President J.D. Vance. He's actually been talking about the idea that Trump should just ignore certain court orders if they fly in the face of what he should be allowed to do as president. He said this as far back as 2021, actually, and I think we can play that tape here. It's from a podcast interview with host Jack Murphy.
I think that what Trump should do, if I was giving him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. And when the courts, because you will get taken to court, and then when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Because this is, I think, a constitutional level crisis.
Vance has also re-upped this comment several times since then when he's been asked about it. And then this weekend he said, quote, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power, unquote. Colby, how do we interpret these comments? I think it's safe to say they're unusual, to say the least.
Yeah, and it's hard to know whether they're making these comments on an official basis, if this is they want to kind of put out this trial balloon and see how people respond to it, or if this is, J.D. Vance and Elon Musk freelancing, and this is just how they feel that the president should be the most powerful person and the president should have the power to ignore a court order that he doesn't like. And so what I think when I've spoken to legal experts this week, most of them that I spoke to are very, very concerned that this is signaling that there's a possibility that if there is an order that President Trump doesn't want to follow, that he will just ignore it. So far, we've had no indication that they are taking that course because they've complied with the restraining orders so far. But it's early, right? It's only 3.5 weeks in. We've got several years to go here. And if at some point over his term he does decide to defy a court order, that's when legal experts start using words like constitutional crisis.
And that would actually be a really historically an extraordinary break for a president to defy a court order.
So, Colby, before we go any further, and we kind of joked about this before, but what actually is a constitutional crisis? How can we really define this?
I think the best way to define a constitutional crisis would be like a deadlock between the branches of government, that they can't come to an agreement, or maybe one branch completely disregarding, the laws of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we do in fact see a deadlock between these branches, it's unclear what happens next. Right. So you have a constitutional crisis, and then what?
Mm-hmm.
Legal experts, those who are, willing to go this far will say things like, and then we no longer have a republic. So that's where we are.
Worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario.
When I talked to legal experts this week, they said the only close analogy is you'd have to go back all the way to the Civil War when President Abraham Lincoln, in the course of the Civil War, suspended the constitutional rule that you have to have a reason to detain people. The government has to have a reason to detain people. And at that point, the Supreme Court justice came out and said, that's unconstitutional. You can't do that. And Lincoln ignored that ruling or that order. So it's really extraordinary. I mean, you have to go back more than 150 years to find a parallel in history where a president has even come close to defying a Supreme Court order.
I think Colby brings up a good point, though, which is, what actually is their intention here? I think there are ways in which merely floating this idea could be advantageous to them. If you look at this and you're a judge and you see it and you think, well, maybe I don't want to test this too much because what if it's going to cause them to actually try and defy a court order? Is that a plausible read on this, Colby? I mean, how much do we see Trump and his allies floating things that seem intended to be kind of strategic in that way?
I think that's really, we've seen Trump do that for years, right? I mean, he uses social media and he uses his rallies to, float an idea, a concept, and the reaction that he gets, both the encouragement from his base and the backlash from people on the left, will often encourage him to take it the next step further.
Justin, what have we seen from the judges? Have the judges really said anything in response to the idea that these orders could be defied? I think we saw the judge in Rhode Island talking about holding people in contempt if they ultimately did defy this court order. What do we see from the judges as far as this moment in time?
Really, that's the only example we've seen of the judges really commenting on this kind of thing. Generally speaking, judges will not get involved in a public conversation. They usually, issue statements through their orders, and they're pretty reluctant to weigh into a public conversation over, what the courts are doing. We did have an extraordinary moment during the last Trump administration. If you remember, at some point, Trump said, there are Obama judges, and Chief Justice John Roberts actually came out and said, no, that's not true. Judges are judges. And he made that public comment, which was a pretty extraordinary moment because, the Supreme Court justices are very reluctant to wade into public conversations. It's possible we see something like that again. If the attacks on judges continue, it's possible, Chief Justice John Roberts comes out again with a public statement.
Yeah, and we did actually see the Chief Justice in his year-end report in late December actually addressing this issue kind of preemptively. It does seem to be something that John Roberts is conscious of and has contemplated as being a threat to the independence of the judiciary moving forward, right?
Yeah, it is something that he's weighed in on.
Yeah, and it's clearly on all of our minds right now. And after the break, we're going to start getting into what would happen then. We'll be right back.
I'm Sally Jenkins, and I'm a sports columnist and feature writer for The Washington Post. My job entails pulling the curtain on really big sports events at what is going on in locker rooms, what's going on in the stadium tunnel, most importantly, what's going on in the minds of the athletes that I cover. I think that we have an instinct that sports are really important in some primal way. We pay a lot of money for them. We build really big stadiums for them. And I think that athletics really gets us in touch with aspiration and teach something very, very important about accountability, about self-determination. And so my job is to really make those links explicit for readers and users. Subscriptions support this work and the people behind it. Find out more at subscribe.washingtonpost.com. I'm Sally Jenkins, and I'm one of the people behind The Post.
So, Justin, we were talking before the break about whether this is going to happen. Now I want to talk about what happens next. What happens if an administration does take a court order and say, no, we're not going to do that because we think that's not a legitimate court order? What happens at that point?
The truest answer and the most basic answer is we don't actually know because this situation doesn't happen, But in talking with legal experts this week, they sort of gamed out how things could go. And most of the ones I talked to said Trump would probably not defy an order before it was ruled on by the Supreme Court, because right now the Supreme Court has a
6-3 conservative majority.
Yeah. So
they have checked him in certain instances,
Yes.
but they also gave him a significant degree of immunity recently.
Yeah.
A lot of three of his appointees are on that court.
Exactly.
So why would you defy it before it ever got to the Supreme Court in the first place?
Exactly. You have a very friendly Supreme Court who's probably going to rule with you on a lot of things. But if that were to happen, if the Supreme Court issues an order against one of Trump's executive actions and the president came out and said, I'm not going to follow this order, the plaintiffs in the case could actually go back to a judge and ask for the judge to hold the party in the case, which would probably not be President Trump. It would probably be the head of the agency that was being sued, like the head of the EPA, and ask for that person to be held in contempt of court. If the judge were to agree that the head of the agency was not following the law and not complying with an order, he could then, or she could then, impose fines on the head of the agency. If the person was still objecting to following the order, the judge could even order the person jailed.
Yeah, we could be talking about U.S. Marshals being dispatched.
And then even beyond that, the judge could refer the head of the agency to the Department of Justice for prosecution. Now, that's how it normally works. The problem is that the judicial branch does not have any enforcement authority. The judicial branch relies on the executive branch to carry out enforcement. So in other words, if a judge were to hold the head of an agency in contempt and order that person jailed, U.S. Marshals, who are under the executive branch, would be the ones to carry that out. So it's hard to imagine that a Trump administration is going to order its own U.S. Marshals to jail one of its own administration officials. And legal experts say, that's where the whole thing breaks down.
Right.
Perhaps the most important aspect of a court finding the president in contempt would just be the political fallout. And it would be such a rupture politically and legally that it might actually spur action by Congress to impeach the president, or Congress could also withhold funding from the president if they viewed that he was not complying with a court order. So there are a number of actions, but
right, like maybe do the Republicans in Congress worry about this blowing back on them and them losing their seats in the 2026 midterm elections or something like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Colby, the thing I keep coming back to with this is is this just alarmist? Are we actually imagining these kind of worst case scenarios? I think about that, but then I think J.D. Vance is talking about these things. Elon Musk is promoting people who are talking about these things. This is something that they're injecting into the conversation for whatever reasons. So I guess what's your take on that? How legitimate is this for us to be considering right now?
Yeah. And, my role here at the Washington Post is to cover threats to democracy. And I think about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris at the end of the election warning the American people that Trump had no respect for democracy and democratic norms. And I've talked to some legal experts this week, and one made the really good point that even if he doesn't defy the courts, the things that he's done in the 3.5 weeks have already amount to a constitutional crisis. He has, steamrolled Congress, canceling programs and agencies that were appropriated. You can't do that. That is violating the checks and balances in the Constitution, the separation of powers. Congress has the power to decide how money is spent. They direct the White House how to spend that money. The president can't just unilaterally decide not to spend it. And then you have Elon Musk. You have a private citizen who's completely unaccountable to the voters, who has massive power over what's happening right now in Washington. And he is just slashing and burning the federal government. No one appointed him or nominated him. No one confirmed him. Usually a position of that much power would usually go through the Senate. The Senate has the right to advise and consent a nominee. The president never put Elon Musk up for nomination. So those two things, when you look at those, and Elon Musk is also a billionaire. He's
with contracts with the government.
With billions of dollars of contracts with the federal government. There's a massive conflict of interest. And something I wrote about this week, they just fired the director of the government, the Office of Government Ethics. And so the person who would do the kind of investigations into those conflicts of interest has been let go. They're systematically taking all of the independent watchdogs out of the federal government that would call them out.
The inspectors general.
The inspectors general.
About 20 of them have been fired now.
Right, including the inspector general of USAID, who had put out a pretty scathing report about how just canceling USAID was such a massive waste of taxpayer dollars. The day after that report came out, he was fired.
Yep.
And so there are legal experts that I talk to, and some don't go this far, but there are some that I talk to who say defying the courts would obviously be a huge escalation, but we're already in a constitutional crisis and we're only 3.5 weeks in.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that many of the things that Trump is doing are obviously of dubious legality. Like they seem to be challenging the courts to give them more authority and maybe strike down these existing laws in order to give the president more power, right, Justin? Is that an accurate reading on things?
Yeah. Some of the cases, especially like the firing of the independent agency heads, like the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, seem actually designed to generate cases to get before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has, in recent years, issued a number of rulings where they've really given the president more power over firing and hiring in the executive branch. So a lot of legal observers think that Trump could actually win these cases where he's fired heads of independent agencies. So it could be, it could be a real shift in Washington. I wanted to put in one counterpoint to the more alarmist thinking about Trump. So, I mean, if you look at Trump's history with the courts through his first term and even into the second term, we've heard J.D. Vance and Elon Musk talk about defying court orders, but their record through his first term and the beginning of his second term has largely been to comply with court orders. Trump has railed against judges, he's attacked judges, but in the end, the administration has always followed court orders for the most part as they've been issued. So a lot of legal experts I talk to think it's unlikely that Trump would actually go so far as to openly defy a court order, especially a Supreme Court order, just because that would be such a big rupture. And politically, it might be a bad calculation for him to do that.
Yeah, and that certainly could caution him against it. I think I'd offer, not to get into a debate about it, but I'd offer a couple of counterpoints. One is that we saw in Trump's personal court cases where he basically, a judge ordered him to do things like not talk about people who were involved in these cases, and Trump just kept on doing it. He basically defied those court orders in certain ways.
Yeah.
And the other point is that, he's probably complied with all of these court orders so far, but he also has a lot of people around him now who are different from the people before. He had more establishment Republican people in his first term who, in a lot of cases, who didn't come from kind of the same school of thought, whereas now we have kind of the MAGA administration, people who are brought in because they are loyalists and maybe aren't willing to kind of check Trump's impulses. Colby, do you think that's a valid way of looking at this? No, I'm not saying that means he's going to do it, but also it only takes one time for us to kind of go over this precipice, right?
I think Trump 2.0 is very different than Trump the first time around. This is post January 6th. This is post years of him saying that the 2020 election was stolen from him and sowing immense doubt in our election system. This is a President Trump who's telegraphed that he wants revenge and that he wants to burn it all down. And even the actions that we've seen in the first 3.5 weeks are so different than what we saw in the first Trump administration. They're so much more brazen. They're so much more aggressive. I mean, thousands of federal workers are losing their jobs as we speak. And Congress doesn't seem to be doing much about it.
Yeah. There are things that Trump did in his first term, like fire the inspectors general, and we saw Republicans object to that in ways that they are not doing right now.
They're not. And it's one of the things that's most stunning to me. And, Justin made the really good point that one recourse would be if Trump goes too far, Congress can impeach him. That's the power that they have to hold the president accountable. But currently, we've talked to Republicans. My colleagues that work on Capitol Hill have been talking to Republicans about these issues. And when they ask them about things like him taking away the power of the purse, him making unilateral decisions on spending and appropriations,
taking away these congressional members' power.
Exactly. Taking away their power. A power that, I was up on the Hill for a decade. I mean, being on the Appropriations Committee was the most powerful and important bragging right that you could have in Congress. Members waited their whole careers for a seat on the Appropriations Committee. And now Trump is just saying, you guys don't matter. And Republicans in Congress are doing the equivalent of the shrug emoji. They're just, and it's been stunning to watch them just forfeit that power.
Yeah.
And so would defying a court order be a last straw? Would that be the thing that makes them say, okay, you've gone too far? I don't know. And when our colleagues on the Hill have asked Republicans that question, they'll say, no, I don't think he should defy a court order. But then there's always but these judges are out to get him, or these judges are liberals. There's always that little caveat that makes it sound like they could almost excuse it. But no, we don't want him to. But you have to understand that these judges are not acting in good faith.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that over the years with Trump, which is he plants a seed initially, and Republicans sometimes will initially object to that, but they also feel compelled to toe his line. And then over time, these things that he's talking about doing, like pardoning every single January 6th or granting clemency to every single January 6th defendant, that's something that Republicans said no to right away. They're like, you can't do this. And if you do it, you definitely can't pardon the people who assaulted police. And it seemed kind of crazy initially. And then over time, it kind of just becomes less crazy to them. And they kind of vouch for it in certain ways by saying, oh, well, I don't think January 6th was actually that bad. It's just kind of a progression where he plants the seed. And I think we can't necessarily rule out that that's what he's doing with talking about kind of disregarding the courts, or at least the people around him talking about disregarding the courts, because they do see the potential for these issues to really come to a head. And this could be a way for him to grab a significant degree of power. If he can tell the courts, you can't stop me from doing this, that's a huge degree of power for him, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's already, as we talked about, seized the power of the purse, which is Congress's main check on the other branches. If he were to say to the courts, you can't rule against me, you can't stop me from doing something via court order, that's pretty much the ball game.
Yeah.
He's usurped the power, the main power of Congress. He's usurped the main power of the courts, and that just gives the president extraordinary power, the likes of which we have not seen in history.
Fascinating. Justin, the other thing I wanted to get at, which I think speaks to the Trump administration and its potential disregard for the rule of law. And this blew up on Thursday night, and it has to do with New York City Mayor Eric Adams. We had seen earlier in the week that the Justice Department has moved to drop the criminal charges against Eric Adams, who's been charged with various types of corruption. We now have seen the interim U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. This is the district that brought these charges against Eric Adams, has resigned rather than carry out that order. Her name is Danielle Sassoon. She basically suggests that there is something political about the reason that these charges, that the Justice Department is pushing for these charges to be dropped. Justin, can you just kind of tell us the significance of this and what the big questions are that we're going to be confronting in the days and weeks ahead?
Yeah, sure. Starting with this immediate case, and then we'll look at the broader picture. So, I mean, I think you can say that the Justice Department, in asking for the charges to be dropped against Eric Adams, did assert a political motive and asking for the case to be dropped.
Yeah, they kind of just said it out loud.
They said it out loud. They said, this case is going to occur too close to an election, and by prosecuting Eric Adams, it's going to interfere with his ability to carry out Trump's immigration agenda, which is a blatantly political motive, an extraordinary thing to insert into, a federal prosecution of, a very high-ranking official.
And they also said that this was not a commentary on the merits of the case. Like, they didn't say that this case, at least initially, they didn't say that this case is faulty in some way and the charges shouldn't have been brought because he's obviously innocent or something like that.
Yeah, and in the resignation letter from the U.S. attorney in New York, she touches on that. She said there's nothing wrong factually or with the strength of this case, and I don't feel comfortable ordering these charges to be dropped because we have a good case here. And, she resigned, and then the Justice Department's response was to move the case to Washington, to the Public Corruption Unit. And once they did that, top officials in the Public Corruption Unit also resigned instead of dropping the charges against Eric Adams. And I think underlying this particular set of incidents is a broader push by the Trump administration towards law enforcement and towards the Justice Department. Traditionally, the Justice Department has maintained a certain independence from the president to avoid the politicization of prosecutions. But Trump and his commentary on the deep state and him railing against his own prosecutions has really moved in the opening of his administration to exert much greater political control over the Justice Department. He's ordered a list from the FBI of agents who were involved in the January 6th prosecutions. And I think what you're seeing here is you had what amounted to a loyalty test from the Trump administration in asking top Justice Department officials to drop the prosecution of Eric Adams. And you had Justice Department officials who are aware of this whole push by the Trump administration pushing back and saying, we're not going to politicize what we're doing. We believe there should be some independence in the Justice Department. And, the Justice Department should be free to pursue prosecutions that it deems necessary, unrelated to politics.
Yeah. And then the other thing I think is worth noting here is this U.S. attorney who resigned is not some holdover from the Biden administration. This is somebody who's from the Federal Society, which is a conservative legal group. This is somebody who clerked for former Justice Antonin Scalia, a conservative icon, if there ever was one, on the Supreme Court. And the fact that she would stand up and say there's something amiss going on here, I think that suggests that we're going to be hearing a lot more about this in the coming days. But for now, that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me, Justin.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you also to Colby, who I hear is going to be sitting in this chair a little bit moving forward. She's going to be on Post Reports a lot more in the next few months. Is that right?
The rumors might be true. Yes, I am thrilled. Aaron, you're going to have to give me all of your tips and best practices.
I have zero tips for you. I'm sorry.
I don't believe it. I think that you are an expert. So,
well, we're all looking forward to listening to that. Colby Itkowitz is a democracy reporter for The Post, and Justin Juvenile covers the Supreme Court. If you're tuning in via the Campaign Moment show feed, please make sure to go to Post Reports and The 7 for even more politics coverage throughout the week. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Rena Flores and Rachel Van Dongen. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Lucy Perkins, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, Elahe Izadi, and Martine Powers. So we'll actually be back in your feeds tomorrow with a very special weekend episode of Post Reports. Martine will be speaking to the White Lotus star Natasha Rothwell about the new season of the HBO show, which starts on Sunday. It's a wide-ranging conversation about Rothwell's career, including her time as a writer on Saturday Night Live.
Make no mistake, it was a life-changing experience, and I think that it ultimately made me a better writer. It's where I really understood the adage, be prolific and not perfect, just because I was writing and creating so many sketches week to week. But I think I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that I was the only brown person around the writer's table.
So that's tomorrow on Post Reports. I'm Aaron Blake. Have a great weekend.